The K, Day 4, Chapter 7. It seemed hours, but it was probably only one until Timothy said, "Do not be alarmed now, young boss. I am going to jump into the water and kick this raft to the shore. Without that, we'll pass the island by and by." In a moment I heard a splash on one side of the raft, and then Timothy's feet began drumming the water. I guess he was not afraid of sharks this close in. Soon he yelled, "Bottom, young boss, bottom." His feet had touched sand. In another few minutes the raft lurched, and I knew it had grounded. I listened for sounds from shore, hoping there would be a cheerful hello, but there were none, just the wash of the low surf around the raft. Timothy said, "Here, young bass, on my shoulders, and I'll fetch you to the land." He helped me to his back. I said, "Don't forget Stucat." He laughed heartily. "One at a time, young boss." With me on his back, he splashed ashore, and judging from the time it took, the raft wasn't very far out. Then he lifted me down again. "Land," he shouted. The warm sand did feel good on my feet, and now I was almost glad that we wouldn't have to spend another night on the hard, wet boards of the raft. He said, "Touch it, young bass. Feel the land. 'Tis outrageous good." I reached down. The grains of sand felt very fine, almost like powder. Timothy said, "'Tis a beautiful cay, this cay. Never have seen this cay." Then he led me to sit under a clump of bushes. He said, "You rest easy while I pull the raft more out of the water. You must not lose it." I sat there in the shade, running sand through my fingers, wondering where, among all those many islands in the Caribbean, we were. Timothy shouted up from the water, "Many fish here. Langosta, too. I've been knowing. We roast them." Langosta, I knew, was the native lobster, the one without claws. I heard Timothy splashing around down by the surf and knew he was pulling the raft up as far as he could get it. A moment later, puffing hard, he flopped down beside me. He said, "Catch me breath, then I'll tour the island and select a place for the camp." He put Stucat into my lap. "Camp?" I asked, stroking Big Stu. Timothy replied, "We may be here 2-3 days, so we be living comfortable." He could tell I was discouraged because we had come to the island and there were no people on it. He said confidently, "We be rescued too, before the night. I build a great fire, pile of brush and wood. So the next aircraft that fly over, we set it off." "Where are we, Timothy? Near Panama?" He answered slowly, "I cannot be sure, young boss. Not very sure." "But you said you knew about the banks and the cays that are near the banks." I wondered if he knew anything, really, or if he was just a stupid old black man. Timothy said, "Listen, I know that many banks and cays are around 15 north and 8 long. There is Roncador and Sereno, Quido Suono and Cernelia and Rosalind. Then there is a beacon in North Cay. Off to the west, somewhere is Providencia and San Andreas." He paused a moment and then said, "Far away up there, I think, is the Caymans and then Jamaica. But you are not sure of this island?" Timothy answered gravely, "True, I am not sure." "Do the schooners usually come close by here?" I asked. Again, very gravely, Timothy said, "The man who fishes follows the fish. Certainly the fish be here. I be seed with my own self eyes." I kept feeling that Timothy was holding something back from me. It was the tone of his voice. I heard my father talk that way a few times. Once he didn't want to tell me my grandfather was about to die. Another time was when a car ran over my dog in Virginia. Of course, both times happened when I was younger. Now my father was always honest with me, I thought, because he said that in the end, that was better. I wish Timothy would be honest with me. Instead, he got up to take a walk around the cay, saying he'd be back in a few minutes. Then Stucat wandered away. I called to him, but he seemed to be exploring too. Realizing that I was alone on the beach, I became frightened. I knew how helpless I was without Timothy. First, I began calling for Stucat. When he didn't return, I began shouting for Timothy. There was no answer. I wondered if he'd fallen down and was hurt. I began to crawl along the beach and ran head-on into a clump of low-hanging brush. I sat down again, batting at gnats that were buzzing around my face. Something brushed against my arm and I yelled out in terror, but I heard a meow and knew it was only Stucat. I reached for him and held him tight until I heard the brush crackling and sang out, "Timothy?" "Yes, young bass," he called back from quite a distance. When he was closer, I said harshly, "Never leave me again. Don't you ever leave me again." He laughed. "There is nothing to fear here. I walked round the whole island, and there is nothing but sea grape sand, and a few little lizards, and those palm trees." I repeated, "Never leave me alone, Timothy." "All right, young bass, I promise," he said. He must have been looking all around, for he said, "No water here, but 'tis no problem. We still have water in the keg, and we will trap more on the first rain." Still believing he wasn't telling me everything, I said, "You were gone a long time." He answered uneasily, 30 minutes at most. The island is about 1 mile long and a half wide, shaped like the melon. I found a place to make our camp up near the palm. 'Twill be a good place for a lookout. The rise is about 40 feet from the sea. I nodded, then he said, "I'm hungry, Timothy." We were both hungry. He went back to the raft, took out the keg of water and the tin of biscuits and chocolate. While we were eating, I said, "You are worried about something, Timothy. Please tell me the truth. I'm old enough to know." Timothy waited a long time before answering, probably trying to choose the right words. Finally he said, "Young Bass, there is, in this part of the sea, a few little caves like this one, round about sides by humbug banks. They are cut off from the rest of the sea by these banks." I tried to make a mental picture of that. Several small islands tucked up inside great banks of coral that made navigation dangerous, was what I finally decided on. "You think we are on one of those caves?" "Maybe, young Bass, maybe." Fear coming back to me, I knew he'd made a mistake in bringing us ashore. I said, "Then no ships will pass even close to us, not even schooners. We're trapped here. We might live here forever," I thought. Again he did not answer directly. I was beginning to learn that he had a way of being honest while still being dishonest. He said, "The place I am thinking of is called the Bill's Mouth. 'Tis a U-shaped thing, with these sharp coral banks on either side running maybe 40-50 miles. He let that sink in. It sounded bad, but then he said, "I do hope, young Bass, that I am outrageous mistaken. If we are in the devil's mouth, how can we be rescued?" I asked angrily. It was his fault we were there. The fire pile. When aircraft fly above, they will see the smoke and fire. But they might just think it's a native fisherman. No one else would come here. I could picture him nodding, thinking about that. Finally he said, "True, but we cannot fret about it, can we? We make camp and see what happens." He poured me a half cup of water, saying happily, "Since we have made land, we can celebrate." I drank it slowly and thoughtfully. Chapter 8. During the afternoon, Timothy was busy and we did not talk much. He was making a hut of dried palm fronds. I sat near him under a palm. Now that we were on shore, I again began to think about what had happened to my mother. Somehow I felt she was safe. I was also sure that a search had been started for us, not fully understanding that a war was on and that all the ships and aircraft were needed to fight the U-boats. I even thought about Henrik Van Boven and what a story I would have to tell when I saw him again. I tried not to think about my eyes, sitting there under the palm, listening to Timothy hum as he made the camp. I trusted him that my sight would return within a few days. I also trusted him that an aircraft would spot our fire pile. In late afternoon, he said proudly, "Look, our hut." I had to remind him again, stupid old man, that I couldn't see. So he took my hands and ran them over the fronds. It was a hut, he said, about 8 feet wide and 6 feet deep, with supports made of wood he picked off the beach. The supports were tied together with strong vines that covered the north end of the island. The roof, which sloped back, he said, was about 6 feet off the ground. I could easily stand up in it, but Timothy couldn't, not quite. Timothy said, "Tomorrow we be getting mats to sleep on. We have our own, but tonight we must sleep on the sand. 'Tis soft." I knew he was very proud of the hut. It had taken him only a few hours to build it. "Now," he said, "I must go down to the reef and fetch lagosta. We roast it, to be true." I became frightened again the minute he said it. I didn't want to be left alone, and I was afraid something might happen to him. "Take me with you, Timothy," I pleaded. "Not on the reef," he answered firmly. "I have not been there before. If 'tis safe tomorrow, I will take you." With that, he went down the hill without saying another word. My mother was right, I thought. They had their place and we had ours. He did not really like me, or he would have taken me along. He was different. It seemed as though he were gone for a very long time. Once I thought I heard an aircraft, but it was probably just my imagination. I began yelling for Timothy to come back, but I guess he couldn't hear because of water noise on the reef. The palm fronds above me rattled in the breeze, and there were other noises from the underbrush. I knew Stu Cat was around somewhere, but it didn't sound like him. I wondered if Timothy had checked for snakes. There were also scorpions on most Caribbean islands, and they were deadly. I wondered if there were any on our cay. During those first few days on the island, the times I spent alone were terrible. It was, of course, being unable to see that made all the sounds so frightening. I guess if you are born blind, it is not so bad. You grow up knowing each sound and what it means. Suddenly the tears came out. I knew it was not a manly thing to do, something my father would have frowned on, but I couldn't stop. Then from nowhere came Stu Cat. He rubbed along my arms and up against my cheek, purring hard. I held him close. Soon Timothy came up the hill. shouting, "Young bass, tree nice lagosta." I refused to speak to him because he had left me for such a long time. He stood over me and said, "They are touched them. They are still alive." He was also crowing over his lobster. Almost crowing over his lobster. I turned away. Sooner or later, Timothy would have to understand that he could not ignore me 1 minute and then treat me as a friend the next. He said softly, "Young bass, be an outrageous man if you like, but here I'm all you got." I didn't answer. He roasted the lagosta over the fire, and later we crawled into the hut to spend our first night on the silent island. Timothy seemed very tired and groaned a lot. Before he went to sleep, I asked him, "Tell me the truth, Timothy. How old are you?" He sighed deeply. "More than 70. Even more than 70. He was very old enough to die there. In the morning, Timothy began making the fire pile down on the beach. He had a plan. We'd always keep a small fire smoldering up by the hut, and if an airplane came near, he'd take a piece of burning wood from our small fire to ignite the big one. That way, he said, we could save the few matches that we had. It didn't take him long to stack driftwood over dried palm fronds. Then he said, "Now, young boss, we must say something on the sand." Sometimes it was difficult to understand Timothy. The soft and beautiful West Indian accent and way of speaking weren't always clear. "Say something on the sand?" I asked. "So they'd be knowing we are down here," he explained patiently. "Who?" "The man in the sky, of course." "Oh, now I understood." I guess Timothy was standing there looking at me, waiting for me to say something or do something. I heard him say, "Well, young bass, what do we do now?" I asked. His voice now impatient. He said, "Say something with the rock, with many rock. Every rock be saying something." I frowned at him. "I don't think I can help you, Timothy. I can't see any rocks." Timothy groaned. "I can see the rock, young bass. But what do we say?" I laughed at him, enjoying it now. "We say help." He grunted satisfaction. For the next 20 or 30 minutes, I could hear Timothy dropping rocks against each other, singing softly to himself in calypso. It was a song about fungi and fish. I had fungi in Willemstad down in the Blacks Market at Ruttercade. It was just plain old cornmeal, but most food has different names on the islands. Soon he came to stand over me. "Now, young boss," he said. He seemed to be waiting. "Yes?" There was a silence until Timothy broke it with anguish. "Would the rock say help?" I looked up in his direction and suddenly understood that Timothy could not spell. He was just too stubborn or too proud to admit it. I nodded and began feeling around the sand for a stick. He asked, "What you reaching for?" "A stick to make lines with." He placed one in my hands, and I carefully lettered H-E-L-P, help, on the sand, while he stood above me, watching. He kept murmuring, uh-huh, as if making sure I was spelling it correctly. When I had finished, Timothy said approvingly, "I tell you, young bass, that do say help." Then he happily arranged the rocks on the sand, following my lines. I felt good. I knew how to do something that Timothy couldn't do. He couldn't spell. I felt superior to Timothy that day, but I let him play his little game, pretending not to know that he really couldn't spell.